very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS seminar titled BRICS and the Future of the International Order. To discuss with this topic today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, academic visitor, Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, Assistant Professor, International Relations, London School of Economics and Political Science, and Deputy Director, LSE Ideas. The seminar will be moderated by Dr. Ivan Litrev, Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS NUS. Today's seminar will be live streamed on Facebook. I shall now invite Dr. Ivan to commence the seminar, please. Dr. Ivan, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome all of you to the ISIS seminar on BRICS and the future of the international order. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Mukherjee. He doesn't need any introduction, but in brief, he is now the Assistant Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Deputy Director of LSE Ideas, where I had the opportunity to meet him some time ago. Today, we're going to discuss BRICS and the future of the international order. And as you know, there has been a very big discussion about what exactly BRICS is and how it will impact the international order. And in the last 10, 15 years, there have been more or less two major opposing opinions about what BRICS exactly is and its impact. And one opinion is that BRICS is kind of a coalition of countries that want to transform the international order and to make it much more multipolar, that they are increasingly coalescing together and joining forces. The other opposite opinion is that actually BRICS is a very loose grouping of states, which are riddled by a lot of contradictions, a lot of internal conflicts, and that the main focus of this grouping is primarily symbolic. It's sending a signal to other powers, especially to the United States. And therefore, in this opinion, the BRICS is not going to have actually any major systemic impact on the world order. So with these two very divergent and extreme opinions, it's interesting to know that in the last several years, BRICS has actually progressed a lot. It has expanded its membership. Now it includes Iran, it includes Indonesia, Ethiopia, it has a number of partners. Also, it has started to develop some financial infrastructure, such as BRICS Pay, and also it has started to take political positions. You, for example, can easily see this during the recent Rio de Janeiro summit, where for the first time, BRICS took a position on a current affairs issue, namely tensions and conflict in the Middle East. So with all this in mind, I would like to turn to Dr. Mukherjee and to his presentation. So first we'll have his presentation, and then we'll be more than happy to open the floor for questions. So Dr. Mukherjee, please.
Thank you, Ivan, for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Raghav, also Jordan and Yusuf for putting this event together. It's really a pleasure to be back at ISAS. I lived in Singapore for so long, and I probably came here all of twice. So I'm really happy to come more. It feels like quite far from where I used to teach, but I'm so happy to be back here now on a more regular basis. And I'm also grateful to Professor Sevilla and Hernek for having me here as a visitor. So what I wanted to do was talk about today's topic, which is BRICS, with the caveat that my perspective, unlike probably many things that many of the people who come through here, is more of an academic one, which is has its strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps strength and weakness is to think in structural terms, in broad sweeps of time, as opposed to very current happenings. But I think it is important to think in these terms as well. You do risk missing important moments from that perspective, but you are also able to put them into proper context after the fact and make sense of it in the broader sweep. So with that approach, I ask you to sort of take my comments in that spirit or in that sense. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is polarity and international order, what we mean by these things, what international order looked like under a particular type of polarity for a brief while in the 1990s and 2000s, which is unipolarity, and then ask whether we are actually entering a multipolar international order and what that means. And finally, talk a little bit about things that I focus on a lot in my own work, which is the politics of status and recognition, which I think is a lot of what BRICS is about, right? So when we say is it real or is it symbolic? I actually think symbolic is real, and symbolism matters in politics, and who is standing on which stage and going to which conferences does play a role in how countries think about their foreign policies and what kind of environment is created for the policies of other countries to be pursued, right? So I think symbolic politics are important. So on polarity international order, there was a survey a couple of years ago in 2023 of 68 experts from different parts of the world. I think Shivshankar Menon was one of them, but mostly it was sort of American academics and think tankers, mostly based in the US. So to the extent that you think their opinions matter, 60%, 65% of them disagreed or disagreed strongly that the distribution of power is closer to being unipolar than it is to being bipolar or multipolar. 23% only agreed with this statement, and 12% were neutral, right? So, and you can see from the distribution of responses on the vertical axis of confidence that those who think the world is unipolar are less confident also of their opinions, right? So I asked a similar question to my class over the summer of about 40 students, except I asked them to pick between unipolar, multipolar, and bipolar. And 82% of them thought the world was multipolar, right? So it's a very interesting time we're living in where sort of, I would argue, based at least on this little bit of anecdotal data, that a lot of expert and public opinion thinks that unipolarity is over. I don't think there's much disagreement with that, except perhaps the two guys in the corner, Steve Brooks and Bill Wolforth, who strongly think that the world is still unipolar. But the question is the world becoming multipolar, right? And that depends on what we mean by polarity. So obviously, those who are familiar with this stuff, the traditional usage is, polarity refers to the distribution of power, which is measured as economic and military capabilities. There are different ways of thinking about this. One is the discrete way of thinking about it, which is in fixed units. You just count up the number of great powers, the number of poles in the international system, and you get, whether you have a multipolar, a bipolar, or a unipolar system. And so typically people see the period before the world wars as a multipolar system, and of the world wars, people see the Cold War as a bipolar system, and they see the post-Cold War era as unipolar, now tending towards something else. If you measure continuously, you can do so with the concentration of power. You can say sort of low, medium, high concentration, and it broadly sort of tracks this as well. So over time, the discrete measure, which is a bit more subjective in that it relies on the subjective agreement of a number of IR scholars. And when you ask them who were the great powers of an age, they will tell you that from 1815 to 1945, it was these powers, right? Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and the USA. And then during the Cold War, it was obviously the two superpowers. And today it's the US and maybe China, right? Is the world unipolar? Or not? Was a question. Now, is China a second equivalent pole, or is it a lesser pole? That's another debate. And so the continuous measure sort of produces similar characterizations. It produces inflection points that broadly overlap with the discrete measure, right? So if you look at so I created this graph using the composite index of national capabilities, which is something that political scientists use to study power, and essentially developed the Herfindahl-Hirschman index from that based on the shares of the countries of global composite capabilities. It's basically the same measure that the Department of Justice uses to measure market competition in the US, right? Whether the market is concentrated, whether it's a monopoly, oligopoly, or perfect competition, you can calculate that using HHI, but of course, the thresholds for what counts as concentrated or unconcentrated is set by the DOJ, right? We don't have those kinds of thresholds for IR, but what you can do using this index, so which is made up of 6 components, so military expenditure, military personnel, energy consumption, iron and steel production, urban population, and total population, you can sort of spot broad trends over time and make comparisons over time, right? And so this data goes from 1816 to 2016. And basically, what do we learn by looking at this? So obviously, power in the international system, if you use the Department of Justice criteria, has rarely been more than moderately concentrated, right? So it actually isn't that highly concentrated as we would think, but concentration seems to rise as war approaches. So when you see the Crimean War of 1854, the First World War, Second World War, and so on, as countries build power and armaments and economic capability to fight war, concentration of power goes up in the system, but it quickly falls away after the end of those wars as they stop doing that and other powers start rebuilding and so on, right? The concentration of power fell during the Cold War, right, due to the relative decline of US power relative to countries like the UK, France, Soviet Union, and China. But it has been increasing since the end of the Cold War, which is an interesting thing, right? This is largely happening because of China's rise. So what's happening is power is being concentrated between the US and China, but not so much in other countries, right? So even in today's world, therefore, You can see historically, we are nowhere close to the level of concentration the world was at the end of the two world wars. So when we talk about unipolarity, what do we really mean if this is what the level of concentration was at the end of the Cold War? And can we say then that the world is becoming multipolar if the concentration of power is increasing? Right? It's unclear that that's actually what's happening here, if you measure just in terms of power or capabilities. But why does this matter? So it matters arguably because polarity shapes the nature of international order and the conditions that states other than the great powers have to face and put up with, right? So it's sort of been established for a while that great powers to regulate their own interactions, but also the system, create rules, right? Whether they try to or not, they end up creating rules that govern their relationships with lesser countries. These rules make up what we would call the international order, right? They manage, and the great powers manage international order. Since the early 19th century, at least, they've been doing this, and the world has become more connected. So it enables actually a global governance of sorts, right? And Hedley Bull's quote here basically sort of exemplifies that these countries impose order, their joint will on others through the system. So often other countries are subjected to rules that the great powers themselves would not subscribe to. And that is just the nature of modern international order, which has sovereign equality overlaid with great power privilege, right? Order is hierarchical, right? That it has a lot of different elements of hierarchy, and this hierarchy rests on legitimacy, which is smaller states give great powers the authority to govern the globe, and in return, the great powers provide order. They provide a setup in which countries can flourish, can perhaps manage their conflict and cooperation, and so on. And the nature of hierarchy and an order depends on polarity, right? When there are several great powers in existence, order has to be negotiated, and there are perhaps more checks on the power of individual states. But when there is only one superpower, it has the ability to impose its will on others freely. And that is something that the world did live through for a while under US hegemony, right? So the 1990s and early 2000s were a period that many call a period of unipolarity. Was it stable? It was until it wasn't. The US had carefully built this order, a liberal, quote unquote, order in the West. We can debate whether it's truly liberal or not. But in the process of taking it global, it violated many aspects of that order, right? It became much more unilateralist. It ignored the preferences of non-Western and even Western states when it came to critical junctures. And it turns out that the unchecked power of a unipolar country is not a good idea for everyone else, and frankly, not even a good idea for the domestic politics of that country, as we are living through right now. And so what we have then is this period of what Joseph Stiglitz called the Roaring 90s. It was a period of hectic activity, prosperity, optimism, expanding global governance. It was nice to be growing up at that time, as I was. There was a dot-com bubble. Companies that younger people in this room probably never heard of, like Netscape, Lycos, GeoCities, Napster, and so on, but also some you would have heard of, right? Like Yahoo and Amazon. All of those came about at this time. In the UN Security Council, the notion of security was expanded to include human security. There was greater intervention in civil conflicts around the world. Even sovereignty underwent a transformation with the concept of the responsibility to protect. So there was a remaking of order under the United States unipolarity. There were new issues that came on board, like climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, and so on. And then there was this unbridled optimism in liberal democracy, right? The idea, the famously put forward by Fukuyama, that history sort of, in a Hegelian sense, had ended, and liberal democracy was proved sort of victorious in that process. And then on the economic side, there was this optimism in the Washington Consensus, which was based on market-based solutions to development, enforced liberalization, deregulation, privatization, often called shock therapy in the former Soviet republics, but also in Russia, by the World Bank and the IMF. And now we call it neoliberalism, and critiques have developed of that within the West. But that's sort of the broad trend. And you see this in a way in the numbers a little bit. So if you look at trade as percentage share of GDP from 1968 to 2024, you see this inflection point towards the end of the Cold War. Countries traded a lot more. They developed comparative advantages as globalization grew in the West during the Cold War and globally afterwards. And this enabled many low-income countries to become richer and to enter the middle-income category. Right? You see the same with UN peacekeeping operations. There's a lot of UN Security Council activity. At this time in the 90s, it shoots up from about 5 to almost 20 at any given time. There are interventions in Angola, El Salvador, Cambodia, the Balkans, Somalia, Mozambique, you name it, right? Rwanda, there's various cases. And all of this sort of starts to unravel with in the 2000s with 9/11 and the global war on terror, right? So the US starts to use its power in ways that is incredibly difficult for other countries to manage. It violates all sorts of international laws and protocols, and many of which it had refused to sign up to in the first place. And it engages in these forever wars. Right? Afghanistan was longer than the Vietnam War. Iraq, was famously engaged in on very complicated circumstances, and there were numerous human rights abuses committed by U.S. soldiers abroad. There was the Guantanamo Bay prison. There was the use of enhanced interrogation techniques by the CIA, extraordinary rendition to other parts of the world in allied countries, and of course, surveillance of American citizens themselves through the Patriot Act, so which was sort of enabled legally by the George W. Bush administration. And then on the heels of all of that came the global financial crisis, which sort of showed that the Washington consensus was perhaps not the unbridled success that its boosters had thought it would be. And climate change negotiations started to stall. And in general, liberal democracy started to erode during this period. And so you see the effects of the global financial crisis with the same graph. When you move the sort of marker to 2008, you see how there's been a sort of trading off of globalization. If you measure it as share of global GDP, this is what people call slowbalization, right? At this point, globalization has slowed down. And one of the core pillars of this order that was run by the US is not looking so good anymore. Within countries, there was also greater inequality during this period, or perhaps just inequality was created. This is this famous elephant graph that was made in 2014, which essentially shows you on the vertical axis the real increase in income between 1988 and 2008, and on the horizontal axis where an individual is on the percentile of global income distribution. And what it essentially shows you that during this period, if you were between the 75th and 95th percentile globally, you did not do very well, right? That your income did not go up as much as others. In fact, in some cases, it was negative. And this interval corresponds to the middle class in developed countries, right? So what you see then is the impact of politics or on domestic politics of this sort of economic inequality, whereas the very poor and the very rich benefited from globalization around the world. That's at least what this graph shows. And so what you end up with is, established democracies start to backslide without explicitly becoming undemocratic. So famously, Foreign Monk did this survey that was published in the New York Times a while ago, where they asked, what you can essentially see in advanced industrialized democracies, younger people don't think it is as necessary to live in a democracy than older generations, right? This is of course true not just of advanced industrial democracies. It is also true of other countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, and so on. There's other survey evidence that shows this. And so one can sort of draw a straight line from the excesses of American unipolarity to the rise of Trump. 3 decades of built-up resentment in non-Western countries and in the domestic politics of Western countries culminate in a moment where eventually US politics turns against the US's role in the world. And that's what we're kind of experiencing right now. The rise of Trump has upended much of what we thought we knew about the incentives facing leaders in international politics and international relations. And so we used to think, for example, that allies, especially US allies, enjoyed special relationships with each other, and that states had incentives to signal their commitment to their allies and to protect them in times of crisis. Instead, Trump has at every turn threatened to abandon US allies if they don't increase their defense spending and do more of the US's bidding. We used to think that great powers posed inherent threats to each other, and the expansionist tendencies of one power would be met with balancing and pushback from others. Trump has instead accommodated certain great powers like Russia and its position on Ukraine, and has instead leaned on Ukraine to make concessions in order to achieve a peace agreement. We used to think that free trade was desirable for everyone because the theory of comparative advantage showed that everybody would benefit from trade and an open rules-based trading system. Instead, Trump has imposed large tariffs on all countries in an effort to go back in time and turn the US once again into a manufacturing powerhouse, to actually go against the principle of comparative advantage. We used to think of American exceptionalism as grounded in the belief that the US was a force for good in the world, right? Despite the many bad outcomes of that belief, that is what US exceptionalism stood for. But Trump really cares very little for the world, and we'd like to see America first on every policy issue, from security to migration to trade and the environment. So what all of this adds up to then is a fundamental rejection of the core principles of that liberal order and its institutions. And this order was based on a simple social contract that other countries would accept US global leadership in return for global public goods provided by the US and its allies, with the US bearing a disproportionate cost for the maintenance of that order. But today, there's a growing feeling in US politics that this order has benefited other countries, especially China, more than it has benefited the US and the American people. And so it's therefore a bad deal that has to be reformed or thrown out entirely. And this has impacts on the rest of the international order. The Western core of that order today is divided. The US and EU don't agree on many vital issues, including support for Ukraine, on the importance of NATO, on Russia's position in Europe, and even on China. Right? There's lots of disagreements that have come out into the open. The US has itself done what Dan Nexon and Alexander Cooley call exiting from hegemony. People who studied international order were obsessed with what the rise of new powers would mean for international order. Would China destroy it? Would China preserve it? Very few people thought to think about what would happen when the main guarantor and architect of that order decided to go against it and to attack it. And you've seen that in multilateral, bilateral, unilateral settings. Happy to discuss more in the Q&A. There's been democratic decline within the West, as I showed you, and in other countries outside the West. And unilateralism and bilateral deal-making are now dominating. Everybody's rushing to DC for their own deal to reduce the pain of tariffs. There was a little bit of discussion of that when Amit Hindu organized an event last week on US tariffs and Asia. And capitalism has once again been bent to national objectives in the way that it was in the post-war era. Markets now once again must serve the state both at home and abroad. There's a rise of protectionism, sanctions, securitization of the economy, industrial policy, and export controls, all being led by the US, right? There's no longer this unrestrained rise of multinational corporations that people feared in the 1990s. There's a much more state-led model of economic management, which is actually quite at home in East Asia, because that's how East Asian countries grew. And of course, military conflict is on the rise. So according to data collected by the Uppsala program, 2023 saw the highest number of state-based conflicts since 1946. There were 59 conflicts in 34 countries. And the broader cause of, arguably has to do with the changing global order, which is that once Pax Americana is over, the US is no longer willing to police the world. For better or worse, unipolar, the world at least was peaceful on the whole for many other countries, but not for the specific ones that the US targeted. But now there's not that impulse to sort of go around holding peace processes in Oslo or six-party dialogues or any such thing as the US used to do earlier. So if this is the case, if the unipolar moment of the 1990s and early 2000s is over, what does the world look like now? And the word multipolarity gets used a lot, but it's often expressed more as a desire or a policy objective than an actually objective reality. And it's unclear if the world is really multipolar, at least in the classical definition of the term, as I mentioned, which is based on material capabilities. But we can look at the different components of great power to see if there are new great powers in the making and whether the BRICS can be thought of as that, right? So you think of economic and military capabilities or recognition or global interests and so on. So a simple measure would be purely relative economic power. So this charts share of world GDP at constant prices from 1992 to 2024 for the USA, the BRICS countries, the G7 except the US, and the rest of the world, right? And over time, what you kind of see is that the US has actually maintained a relatively stable share of the global economy from the end of the Cold War to the present. Other G7 members have seen their relative share shrink, right? So Canada, France, UK, Italy, Germany, Japan have shrunk in their share of global GDP. The rest of the world has been broadly stable over time as well. The main increase has been for the BRICS, right? So there might be something here. But the BRICS story is in fact a China story, right? Without China, the share of the BRICS countries remains pretty constant. And so the argument, therefore, is that BRICS is actually China plus plus, right? That is China and a few other countries that seek somehow to ride the coattails of China and become globally relevant. This has implications for how BRICS functions and what impact it has on the international system, right? The story is similar in military spending. So from 1993 to 2024, if you look at 2023, if you look at look at military spending of these countries, of the BRICS countries, you again see that there's a spectacular rise for China. Russia peaked around the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and has increased again since the Ukraine war began. India has gradually increased, but is now plateauing in terms of military spending as a share of global military spending. And Brazil and South Africa are flat or declining, right? So once again, very much a China story. If you think about recognition, so this is looking at the number of foreign embassies hosted abroad from 1992 to 2022. And you can sort of see, so China being the purple line, the thick dashed black line is the median of G7 countries. What is the median number of embassies they host abroad? You can see in a way that this is a measure of diplomatic importance, right? That the more countries have presences abroad, the more they can influence and claim to have influence abroad. But China is the only country that is higher than the G7 median, right? Russia has grown gradually in this picture. Brazil, India, and South Africa have grown rapidly. So there is something happening here where these countries are investing in an area that one can broadly claim some kind of multipolarity of diplomatic presence more than anything else. And so what is the context then for the emergence of BRICS, right? There's a changing distribution of power, which is happening at the global and the regional level. China is rising globally. The India, Brazil, and South Africa are rising regionally relative to their regions. Russia, unfortunately, has been declining in relative terms for a long time in an economic sense. And there's a growing global presence of non-Western or global South countries, right? So embassies are being established, multilateralism is on the rise among these countries, and there's this effort to sort of use soft power to the extent that they can to expand their influence. There is a resentment towards Western domination of the global order. I will talk more about that towards the end of this talk. And there are after effects of the unipolarity of the 1990s and the 2000s. So the excesses of US power have caused a certain amount of consternation and a desire for caution and a desire to build bulwarks against that for the future. Right? And so the path to BRICS then sort of, at least in my understanding, starts around the 90s when some countries that had already experienced the brunt of American power got together, and famously Russian Foreign Minister Primakov suggested the strategic triangle between Russia, India, and China as part of a broader policy of protecting Russian interests. In 1997, Russia and China issued a declaration in which they mentioned quite pointedly that a growing number of countries are beginning to recognize the need for mutual respect, equality, and mutual advantage, which in my world sounds like status equality recognition and inclusion in the global international system, right? In 2001, the SCO was formed, which we all know about now. It's quite more prominent in the news. And in the year after that, the Russia, India, China trilaterals began, right? And this continued for a while, even into the sort of 2020s. At the height of the crisis in 2020 between India and China, there was a virtual RIC summit because of COVID, right? And it was attended by all three countries. And then, of course, India, Brazil, South Africa was established in 2003 as a loose grouping, focused on South-South cooperation and democracy. Democratic countries of the global South focused on economic cooperation and multilateralism, right? So that's sort of the different pieces coming together. And then you have, famously in 2001, Jim O'Neill coins the term BRIC. They had their first informal meeting of BRIC foreign ministers in 2006, the first summit in 2009. And in 2010, BRIC becomes BRICS, right? That's, and then in 2014 is really when you see their signal sort of initiatives come online. So you have the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangement. The NDB is essentially a multilateral development bank established by the BRICS countries to finance infrastructure and sustainable development projects in emerging and developing countries or economies. And unlike the traditional IFIs, the founding members have equal shares in this bank, which is an important thing to note, right? Because it has to do with the dissatisfaction that these countries have had with regard to their own voting shares in the IMF and the World Bank. It has only $100 billion worth of authorized capital, but out of that, only about 53 billion has been paid in, right? So comparing it to the World Bank's capital stands at about 320 billion. The ADB stands at about 310 billion. So this is substantially smaller than those banks, right? The contingent CRA is a multilateral financial safety net created to provide short-term liquidity among member countries, offering an alternative to the IMF. Now, this is done to protect against balance of payments crises and currency volatility. It has a capitalization of 100 billion. The IMF has a capitalization of 932 billion. Again, vastly smaller than what actually exists out there, right? So anyway, that's just a little digression on these two institutions. China proposes an expansion of BRICS in 2017. Nothing really happens until 2024, when you get Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE joining. Saudi Arabia has held its cards close to its chest. It's showed up in Brazil for the summit, but has not officially joined BRICS, according to recent news reports, right? So Saudi Arabia is playing a very, walking a tightrope on this one because of its relationship with the US. What does the BRICS focus on, right? So in terms of principles, they focus on sovereignty, mutual respect, and equality. Again, going back to the China-Russia Declaration of 1997. They focus on global governance reform, so reform of the UN Security Council, a big agenda item for India and Brazil in particular. They focus on reform of IFIs and the financial institutions. China also cares about that. They are focusing on reduced economic dependence on the West through these new mechanisms, the BRICS Pay and other sort of economic initiatives or fintech initiatives. And they focus on South-South cooperation and solidarity with Global South countries, and specific issue-based cooperation on global public goods, such as counterterrorism and climate change. But the BRICS does face some challenges despite this ambitious agenda and storied history. The first is, of course, China's dominance. As I mentioned, this is largely underpinned by the economic might of China and its growing military presence. This obviously means that other countries in BRICS will feel like second fiddle powers in due course, or perhaps already do. And this has all kinds of implications when they have rivalries and disputes, as India does with China. So the India-China rivalry is often cited as the biggest obstacle to greater BRICS partnership and activities. It also has sort of conflicting priorities. Not everyone is on board with an alternative currency that is grounded in the renminbi or even a BRICS currency. India has at times voiced its disapproval of that kind of initiative. And of course, the three democracies, India, Brazil, and South Africa, do have, or at least until recently, had fairly positive relations with the United States. As conflicted as they were, or as contentious as they were, they did have reasonably good relations, which created a divide within BRICS, with China and Russia on the one hand, and the other three countries on the other. And so in a way, what Trump is doing now is actually a gift to China and Russia. There are the initiatives that the BRICS has sort of put forward are relatively weak. As I mentioned, the NDB and CRA are nowhere close to having the financial power that existing IFIs do. There's also this challenge tension between representation and effectiveness. So as you expand BRICS, the tendency is therefore you let too many cooks into the kitchen, you become less effective, right? And so clubs work for a reason, is because their membership is limited. Even in the WTO, there was small group decision making, which then presented options and proposals to the larger membership. So BRICS will face these problems and does already face them to some extent. And then there's the issue of actual representation in terms of the Global South. Who speaks for the Global South is a question that many other countries of the Global South have asked. It is often contended that Russia is not a member of the Global South, which it is not. Is China still a member of the Global South, given that it is so powerful and rich today, right? So there are contentions here by other countries such as Nigeria or Pakistan and so on about the representativeness of this grouping, right? Which does hamper its ability to undertake initiatives in a coordinated manner. On the reserve currency, I mean, this is sort of something that the CFR had put out last year about the extent to which other currencies have caught up to the dollar. The dollar obviously has declined as a percentage of globally allocated reserves, but you can see that the renminbi is far, far, far behind. The euro is probably the next contender, but that too, at this point is unclear. So dollar dominance still seems, and there are people in this room who know this much better than I do, it seems that it is still here to stay for the foreseeable future. And then, of course, there is the broader political criticism leveled by Jim O'Neill himself, saying that the BRICS don't matter, right? That essentially he says that truly global challenges cannot be addressed through narrow groupings like the BRICS or even the G7. And he actually advocates, therefore, for a rejuvenated G20, right? Which he said was effective in the aftermath of the financial crisis and reflects the world's complexities. And so, in a sense, if your criticism is that the West is a club that controls the international order, the problem is not solved by creating another club, right? And so in some sense, the criticism is leveled against the BRICS for doing that. There are also problems in the world that are truly global, that the Global South or BRICS alone cannot solve. And other countries, others do argue that G20 is probably the better venue for North-South cooperation. But of course, historically, North-South cooperation has not gone very well for the Global South. There is the memory of the new international economic order proposals of the 1970s is still quite strong in many capitals, where a more just and equal order was called for and was subsequently denied and sort of pushed aside at the UN. Right? So it's clear then that in material terms, the world is not trending towards multipolarity. It looks more like bipolarity, China plus plus. But China also still remains behind the US economy and quite far behind on military spending and capabilities. It also looks like the BRICS is so far largely symbolic, with weak institutions, significant tensions between members, and very little chance of overtaking the international infrastructural power of the US, right? The US, the plumbing of the international financial system, as people say, right? And other things, the system of alliances, right? US has, on last count, 66 allies. China barely can hold on to one or two, right? So why then does BRICS persist? And why is it dissatisfied with an international order that has largely added to the rise of at least 4 of its members, not Russia, but the other 4? And so this is a question that I ask in my own book with regard to rising powers, which is why do they often undermine an order that has enabled their rise, right? By definition, they're doing better than everyone else. They're rising more than their relative power is increasing. So why change something that's working so well? And it's related to a question that people ask of the BRICS members other than Russia, which is why do they not sanction or condemn Russia for the war in Ukraine, right? Which according to virtually all Western analysts and policymakers represents an all-out assault on the international order and its core principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination. And these puzzles are hard to answer from a purely material standpoint, because IR theory tells us that states are rational actors and seek to maximize their security and economic well-being. So if an order is producing substantial economic and security benefits, it should be supported and protected. But we don't see this behavior from the BRICS countries, especially those that are benefiting the most from the order, which is China and India. And I argue that the answer lies in the fact that material goods are not the only thing that matter to countries. Security and economics is not everything. They also care about things like status, respect, recognition, mutual consideration, the very things that China and Russia mentioned in their 1997 declaration. And history shows us that the great powers form this a sort of exclusive club to manage international order. You can think of the Concert of Europe, the Executive Council of the League of Nations, the UN Security Council. International order is not democratic, it is oligarchic, right? And the great powers manage an order through international institutions. Today, that is the UN, the WTO, the NPT, the Climate Change Convention, and a whole host of treaties and international law. And rising powers, as they grow, develop this greater self-confidence and seek recognition of their growing importance in the order. They seek membership of this club as symbolic equals of the great powers. This means that even though they are less powerful, the order should give them the same privileges that it gives to the great powers. But institutions are often designed to preserve the privileges of a few. A club is useless if anyone and everyone can join it, right? So there is this inherent tension here. And it's only if an order's institutions can accommodate these newcomers, these new powers, that you get more cooperative outcomes. Otherwise, you get a lot of conflict, delegitimation, and contestation. And this I show in 3 cases in my book, which I'm not talking about today. Historically has been true of the US with regard to Europe, Japan with regard to the Americans and the British in the interwar period, and India during the Cold War. Right? And we see a sort of similar politics being played out now among the BRICS minus Russia in the liberal order of today, right? They have benefited immensely. The WTO has made them rich. IFIs have given them easy access to development finance. The NPT has prevented widespread nuclear proliferation. I'll just take a couple more minutes and then I'll be done. And the UNSC has managed to preserve peace, by and large, barring glaring omissions in Syria and Rwanda. But as these countries rise, they seek representation. That China complains about consistently not being given its due in the international system. India seeks what it calls reformed multilateralism. Brazil wants strategic autonomy. Russia resents its decline and marginalization in Eurasia. So ultimately, BRICS is about having that greater voice and recognition in a system of global governance that actually has worked quite well. This is not a group of countries, except for Russia, that is trying to destroy what's out there, right? It's actually that they would like to run it as co-equals of the Western powers. But from their perspective, the West has always been exclusionary. And you can see this to some extent. There is data on UN leadership positions, for example, which shows between 2012 and 2019, which is when it was collected, this data, that across all UN organizations, the US and its allies, UK, France, Germany, dominate the staffing of international institutions. Countries like China, Japan, Brazil, and others, Russia and India are far behind, right? And so I'll just end here because I'm obviously grossly over time. But Okay. Well, anyway, I don't want to keep talking. The BRICS won't defend an order that doesn't grant them the kind of recognition that they seek, right? They don't feel any ownership over this order. And they share with Russia in that sense, the other countries of the BRICS, a sense of being outside the inner circle of the order. And this is why they have frequently articulated a desire for multipolar order. And multipolarity in today's world is not just about the distribution of power, but about the more equitable distribution of status and legitimate authority in the institutions of the rules-based order. This is what people mean when they say the world is becoming multipolar. The US remains materially preponderant, but is significantly degraded in terms of the legitimate authority required to claim leadership of this order. And so the Ukraine war then becomes an opportunity for these countries, both in material terms, but also in terms of status, right? China, of course, benefits from a weaker West, but there are also status benefits. Not following the West at this critical time puts the BRICS countries in a position of their own that global South countries can latch onto and actually see as an exemplar of how to navigate this current conflict in Europe. The limiting factor in all of this, of course, is that a Russia that overextends itself kills the project of multipolarity. So there is a limit to which the other countries would be willing to let Russia go. If it looks like the war is going to go very badly, or if nuclear weapons are on the table, I don't think India or China would be happy or sanguine about that. I'm just going to skip this one and talk about what's ahead, right? Since there's the future of the international order in the title. I'll just summarize by saying what looks like a crisis for the West is really seen as an opportunity in the rest of the world. If you sit in Europe and listen to the things that people say about international order, it's very different from what people in Singapore or Delhi are saying. There is a sense of opportunity in the rest of the world that the Europeans now just see as crisis, right? A couple of years ago, Joseph Borrell, the chief European diplomat at the time, told the incoming class of the European External Action Service that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. And their job was to make sure that the jungle does not invade the garden, right? So there's a sense that everything is falling apart for Europe. Not so for the rest, right? BRICS plus, or maybe China plus plus, will keep some kind of order alive. It may not be the liberal international order as we recognize it, but it will look like some form of cooperation centered on multilateral institutions and free market capitalism, because that is the thing that has actually benefited all these countries. The order will be contested and fragmented. That is, rising powers and global South countries themselves don't get along and have many conflicts of interest with each other. There isn't a unifying civilizational ethos, if you will, of sort of Westernness that unites them, or non-Westernness. But the US and Russia will stand out as revisionists in this system. It is almost an inversion of the Cold War, right? Where others would prefer the status quo, but a reformed one so that they have more voice and representation. But the US is the one that is now out to break this order. And from the Western perspective, at least, Russia is also breaking it significantly through the war in Ukraine. And I'll just leave this up, which is a graph of UNGA voting patterns of the BRICS countries relative to the US, modeled spatially to go from +4 to -4, which is essentially 4 being the most ideal liberal order position and -4 being the most illiberal position. And the graph runs from 1946 to 2022. And what you can see very clearly is how the BRICS countries have clustered together at this midpoint, which is between the two extremes after the end of the Cold War. And so there is this emergence of the BRICS that takes place. You can even date it back for some of these countries to the 1970s and the New International Economic Order project, where you see this sort of coming together without Russia. Because for the longest time, Russia and the US mark the bounds of this space, right, in terms of liberal and illiberal. But what's also interesting, very briefly, is that all these countries are further away from Russia in the 1990s and 2000s than Russia is to the US. They are less aligned with the US position on liberal order than Russia has been for this entire time, right? This is something that when people say, oh, India does this because it depends on Russia for defense, or China does this because it's got, all kinds of ties to Russia and so on, there were prior preferences driving a lot of this. There is a sense of resentment with the global order that it creates fertile ground for these kinds of relationships. It's not that Russia is driving all of this or somehow hoodwinking the global South into becoming anti-Western. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee, for this wonderful presentation. Well, I'll use my privilege as the moderator to ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll open the floor So let me first start with one very simple, almost layman question. Why BRICS and not the SCO?
Right.
Because obviously both are very important kind of vehicles for multipolarity or challenging kind of unipolarity. So why BRICS? And my second question is, how does BRICS, even as a symbolic organization, kind of shape the foreign policies of its members toward the US, which is still the most important country in the world? And I'm asking because there is this very interesting theory called inclusive institutional balancing, which essentially believes that that being member of such a club like BRICS practically limits the options and the foreign policies of its members. And in some ways, it is expanding precisely because in order to reduce the foreign policy options and the foreign policy room for maneuver of its members. So what do you think on these two questions?
Thank you. Why BRICS and not the SCO? I presume you're asking in terms of my focus, or why are these countries investing in BRICS and not the SCO?
Yes, which of the two would be kind of the most important vehicle for attempted multipolarity, even as a symbol?
I mean, I think if multipolarity is what you care about, then the SCO being so driven by China and Russia, that it's a bit harder to achieve those goals within that setup. I mean, Brazil, I think, is a long way off from these problems, and yet plays a very crucial role in many parts of the international order. India as well, is not always on board with various SCO positions. I think India has joined every Chinese initiative as a hedge to see where these things go and to influence the evolution of those initiatives, be it the AIIB, the BRICS, SCO, and so on. And there's also, of course, some degree of status that comes from just being separate and part of these different organizations. And so I think BRICS is just globally more representative. And I think, therefore, if your goal is to create multipolarity and perhaps have some freedom of action, if you're not China or Russia, BRICS is perhaps the better venue to do that. Because also the other members of the SCO, many of them are Central Asian nations that have historically been susceptible to Russian influence and increasingly Chinese influence. So yeah, so true multipolarity is perhaps better sought through BRICS than SCO. The BRICS impact on the foreign, so does BRICS constrain its members? That's a great question. I mean, yes, I think like any other coalition of countries or grouping, there's always politics between these different countries. I think NATO constrains the foreign policies of its members, right, in many important ways. So in some sense, this is a negotiated process that every international group, I wouldn't call BRICS an international institution because it's not so formalized, but any international coalition of countries must deal with, right? And so the answer is yes, it does, but every country optimizes within that. And so in some sense, BRICS at times is a multiplier for certain countries, on issues like climate or even COVID. But at other times, it hinders the ability of countries to get what they want. But that is precisely the goal of diplomacy and geopolitics. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So now let's open the floor for questions. Any hands? Please.
Often you talk.
If you can just kind of introduce yourself.
My name is Paras. I'm doing PhD here. Thank you. So often when we talk about rising powers, we talk about status inconsistency. That powers are not satisfied with their status. What if they are satisfied with status? So for example, India, scholars have argued that in terms of power and attribution, it's satisfied with status. So is it that domestic politics is gaining more, this symbolism that we see in terms of status, the optics is directed more to like domestic audience, even for America? So it's like Ikenberry and all have argued like hegemony 3.0, which is more directed towards like domestic politics. So what if the audience is not substantially international, but domestic?
Yeah. Should I take individual?
Yeah, I think that would be better for now.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important thing. I think that most of the work on status is focused on international and state level audiences rather than publics. But there is plenty of evidence historically that states, and this is, it always it shouldn't surprise IR researchers, but I guess it does, that domestic politics matters. I think most reasonable people would immediately agree with that. But I think it is in rising countries in particular. I was looking at the US case in the 19th century, and you see the same dynamics where there's a certain degree of desire among the US population in the mid-19th century, early to mid-19th century, for a greater role in the world, equality on this alongside the Europeans. And they were quite aggressive towards the British, who they saw as some constraining their ambition, especially in the long aftermath of the War of 1815 and so on. So, and there's this sort of records left by the British minister in Washington, who's the ambassador, who basically says, look at these people, they have nothing to back them up, but they have all this swagger, right? Tomorrow, one war could decimate this country, but they carry themselves with such self-importance. That is kind of how people talk about India today, in many parts of the world. And so there is this sense in which domestic audiences absolutely matter, and they do drive a lot of the foreign policy, and a lot of the signaling happens to satisfy those constituencies. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, Sandeep.
Hi. Thank you, Rohan. That was very informative. I have a couple of questions. One is this very interesting discussion about the future is bipolar or multipolar. What does a world like that, when we eventually reach there, which I've been hearing forever, this rising power idea, when we eventually reach to this bipolar, multipolar world, what does it look like beyond just a rearrangement of seats on IMF or something like that, like a more India getting a seat on UNSC or something, like, right? A real multipolar, bipolar world. The bipolar world that I can think of is Cold War. Cold War was created out of Second World War, which gave Russia a certain sphere of influence, right? Like it had direct control over Eastern Europe, and that control was to a certain degree respected by the United States. China, I can't imagine without an apocalyptic war recreating a situation where it would have a sphere of influence in Asia of that sort. It's surrounded by American allies and countries which are not particularly would be eager to see, even Russia would eager to see China expand in any way, right? So what I'm saying is that, are we talking about bipolar world where basically Chinese have a much richer economy and more military expenditure, but at the end of the day, the reality of the situation kind of remains the same as it is today. And the alliance structure as it is kind of remains the same 20 years down the line. Are we in that sense then in bipolar world or multipolar world? I mean, I wonder what a multipolar, bipolar world would look like in a very different way. The second is about this idea of BRICS in both ways. In some ways is masquerading as a global South project, which is kind of a continuation of something that has continued from end of Second World War, right? Like creating some kind of a global South organization, Colombo Powers, NAM, all these things, IORA, all sorts of organizations that have come about, which kind of amounted to nothing at the end of the day. But at the same time, this is perhaps the first organization which is very explicitly just excluding United States. The previous organizations always said all great powers, including Soviet Union history and things like that, right? Here you have a very clear anti-US or anti-Western positioning, right? Because you're basically bringing everybody else together. Does that kind of positioning make it more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Sandeep. I like that you called it informative, because I feel like that's a nice neutral way of describing what I did. Yeah, so what does multipolarity or bipolarity look like in practice? It's like asking, are we in a Cold War 2.0, right? It's the same kind of, I mean, we're not. And I think that is largely due to China's economic interpenetration with so many different countries, right? So in some sense, building the Iron Curtain was also not costless. I think it took a lot of use of force and resources for the Soviet Union to maintain the empire that it did. It wasn't just like hands off, you recognize your sphere, we recognize ours. There was a lot of contention and violence that went into that, right? So one could imagine a world in which that kind of violence is on the table for China, right, for its neighbors. But the interpenetration of that world, I think, disincentivizes China from doing that, because then it sort of kills the goose that is laying the golden egg for China, right? So in that scenario, maybe an economic sphere of a sphere of influence looks more economic than geopolitical, right? Which is that it is economic influence that China has built around its region, and that is what ultimately starts to yield some kind of dividends on geopolitical issues, right? It is not so much coercion, which is very costly and would essentially disrupt these relationships. And ASEAN is meanwhile trying its own project in the region, or sort of what Evelyn Go calls omni-enmeshment. And of course, if you talk to anyone in DC or any of these sort of Australia or whatever, even Beijing, they'll be like, it's a failed project, it's a talking shop and so on. But the fact is that East Asia has not seen violent conflict or even very intense security competition of the kind we're used to in other parts of the world since the end of the Cold War. So ASEAN has done something. Whether you like it or not, there is something going on here that has actually restrained various actors in the region from the worst possible outcomes, which are the real counterfactuals here. So I think that ultimately then the terrain on which all of this will be fought will be economic more than anything else, because that is ultimately, in a way, it's a very interpenetrated world. So sphere of influence may not even be the right framework, right? With due respect to the people who are now talking about return of spheres of influence, I don't think that that's the right framework to think about this. So I guess I'm agreeing with you in that sense. On multipolarity, it's possible for international order to look a bit more like the concert of Europe, right? Which is countries that don't necessarily get along on many issues, but have an interest in maintaining some sort of stability and ensuring that others don't infringe on their interests, having this sort of very uneasy coalition and uneasy accommodation to collectively manage an international system. That was just at that time Western Europe, but this could be a more global thing, right? The other option is retreat into your own corners, right? So each country seems to have picked certain issues. India is focused on climate, Brazil is focused on trade, South Africa, unclear right now what necessarily they are focusing on, but that could be another. Those with global reach like China focus on all the issues, of course, like that, but they build competence in different pieces of the international order, and that becomes the place where they lead, right? Or it is in their own regions, perhaps, that they exert that leadership. So it is fragmented no matter how you think about it. BRICS masquerading as a global South project. So you're saying what sets BRICS apart is that it is explicitly anti-Western, whereas in the past, other organizations have been willing to invite the West in, at least as an observer. Is that fair to say?
Right?
Yeah.
And they always make a point to say that we are not anti-Western. Here,
Yeah.
we all you're basically keeping US out and everybody else in.
Yeah.
Basically, everybody else in, right?
Yeah.
Then you are essentially signaling that it is to a certain degree a
Yeah.
US
Yeah.
minus project.
Yeah, like this is what Danny Quah calls the world order -1, right? Which is that this idea that, can you imagine, and this is perhaps some of the conversation on tariffs as well was heading in that direction, that as markets readjust, as firms readjust, as capitals readjust, as in political capitals readjust, the US starts to get, its role starts to get diminished. So there, I think we have to make a very clear distinction between the US and the West. I think the US is perhaps more isolated in all of this. And there is a certain relational element here, right? Which is the US sees Modi, Xi, and, or let's say Trump sees Modi, Xi, and Putin holding hands, and he gets triggered by that, right? That then sets off a certain set of reactions that then feeds into whatever dilemma is existing in this case, right? It's not just that these countries have said you're out, and it's also that the US is pushing itself in a way, pushing back against these countries in a way that creates that rift even more, right? So Trump says anyone who goes along with the BRICS agenda will face the wrath of the United States or whatever, right? So this is not a one-hand clapping business, right? This is like both hands are bringing it together in that sense. So yes, I mean, it is different in that way, but the role of the US as an order provider is also radically different today than it was during the Cold War. And the US is not willing to play by those rules anymore. And so the US is operating differently. There's no reason why this, in a relational sense, then BRICS also does not operate differently. If the US became a more cooperative actor, there's no reason why it could not be part of this, this grouping, right? But right now, I think it is as an observer or something, right? But it's too early as well. Like the BRICS is still not a thing yet in a major way, right? And what happens tomorrow when India and China have their next thing? Where does BRICS go there? I think there's this moment now. It feels very much like 1962 for India, where you played this big game of non-alignment, and then when the Chinese were at your doorstep, none of the non-aligned they were non-aligned against you as well. And I think Modi's feeling that a bit right now. I guess this has been recorded. Well, anyway. So there's a sense in which India's foreign policy has fallen flat a little bit, right? This idea that you don't form any alliances, you're omni-aligned, multi-aligned, whatever that means. What does that all mean when you have a crisis and other countries are not willing to back you in that moment, right? So it feels very much like 1962 in that way. Anyway, that's a digression, but thank you.
Thank you. Nishant, please.
Thanks, Rohan, for a lovely presentation. Nishant from RSIS. So I just wanted to ask you about another aspect that I feel is a reaction to this sort of a breakdown in global governance is the rise of minilateralism. And from what I see, or my thoughts are, wouldn't like minilateral institutions like the I2U2 or the Quad confer a lot more status to a country like India because it's in one sense in a very strong alignment with at least the US rather than the BRICS. So in terms of these two institutions like the BRICS and you look at some of these minilaterals, which do you think do you think that the status politics or status interests are better served by some of these minilaterals? And if so, then what does the BRICS provide in terms of status for India? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think it's not a question of either or, right? It's like yes and that it is all of these things that play a role in shoring up India's position. If India can show, and if the question is about India, but it's also applicable to other countries, right? That if you can show that you are somehow well aligned with a host of different countries, then when the time comes to press your case on representation at the highest international levels, be it the UN Security Council or some other, the G20 and so on, right? I think being exclusive about partnerships does not always help. So there is this tension then going back to what I said previously, which is your bilateral objectives may not play out as well, but your multilateral and global objectives are well served by having multiple partnerships. So by being diplomatically promiscuous, you actually create coalitions that can, and you can even act as a bridge across coalitions, right? And so the fact that India has such good relationships with Gulf countries at the moment is quite remarkable. And it's something that allows India to act as a bridge with other groupings that it is a part of, right? And, Iran and Saudi are both invited to BRICS, and both, Iran has joined and Saudi has almost joined. That's something, right? So in that sense, there is a status that comes from being that bridging power that I forget who called it at some point, right? But the challenge starts to come in when the government says we're no longer a bridging power, we want to be a leading power. Because to be a leading power, you have to be willing to upset others. And you have to be willing to be called hypocritical and pay the costs of your mistakes, or not pay them, as it were. The greatest privilege of being a great power is to continue doing the same thing over and over again with impunity. Invade other countries, don't pay a cost, move on, do it again, right? If you want to be a leading power, then you have to play that game. I don't think India is ready to be a leading power. I think it is very well suited to be a bridging power at this moment, and maybe in the future, it can be a leading power. Because being a leading power requires taking positions on things and making enemies.
Other questions? We can take 1-2 questions in a row because we're kind of slowly moving toward the end of our session. Okay, well, Sandeep, please.
Yeah.
About the membership and about the expansion.
Yeah.
What do you think is the BRICS expansion in particularly going to do to BRICS, especially now that they're talking about all sorts of countries, almost all Southeast Asian countries given I was thinking, I think in early 1990s, Thailand, a US ally, became part of non-alignment. And then India and Thailand made the statement that we need to make non-alignment as the center of all conversations. This is the unipolarity movement. And that was, at that point, non-alignment had lost all meaning, right? Like, because if a US ally can also be part of. If you have Iran, something like Iran, which was just bombed by the US, and UAE, which is like fairly close to US, right? So you have these kind of members, then how does BRICS as anything function?
Yeah, no, that is exactly the point about representation versus effectiveness, right? Which is, if it isn't a somehow coherent coalition of countries that has a certain identity that ties it together, be that Westernness or Latin Americanness or Southeast Asianness, if it's just this global grouping, it starts to replicate the UN, right? And maybe that's ultimately what it will look like. And this is something that you can sort of trace in India's sort of official statements on UN Security Council reform, which have started to become more and more dissatisfied with the complete lack of any intent or pace in that process, right? And more recently, India started saying, if this doesn't work, we will have to look elsewhere. And this may be the answer to that, which is you start to create, over time, you can see a trajectory where, I mean, you might be able to see a trajectory in the future where BRICS starts to take on SCO-like properties, right? But on a more global scale, which is that your goal is to address security issues and cooperation between countries, and you have these attached economic bodies. It's essentially replicating the UN system, right? You have the IFIs that are attached to the BRICS now. You have NDB, CRA. You have BRICS itself, which acts as the UNGA. Within that, you have the founding members who are like the Security Council, as it were. It's all replicating what already exists, right? Again, IR theory doesn't tell us why this should happen, but I think it is because this is a domain in which these countries can be the top players. They get the most recognition and the ability to call the shots, which they were not getting in the existing global governance mechanism. So this is now a parallel global governance mechanism that is being set up over time.
Please, we'll take 2 questions in a row. Please, yeah. Please use the microphone.
Thank you so much for your talk. Just on that, actually, I wanted to ask about, because we just spoke about BRICS kind of becoming a US -1 situation and how this is sort of an alternative global governance. But as we know, there's a lot of dissatisfaction about, even in like current global governance platforms, about how you bring about like consensus to situations. So given that they want to expand BRICS, and there's already a bit of diversity in BRICS about, for instance, Russia wants to have an alternative rating agency. They want an alternative to IMF. Just given that, and considering that India is one of the early members, how would you suggest that India could realistically shape the agenda of this grouping to align with the interests? Given that in bigger platforms, it's much more difficult to do it, but here you have an early founder advantage.
Thank you. Mriganika from ISAS. My question is sort of attached to what has been asked and the response that Dr. Mukherjee gave. Given the parallel global governance mechanism, I wanted to ask, since that none of the powers that are currently member of BRICS provide a very stabilizing alternative, what would be the agency of this alternative governance framework that they're bringing about, and whether it would even be possible to leave America out when it comes to being a more stabilizing option in the global order? Thanks.
Any further questions? Anybody, please?
Thank you, Rohan, for the very insightful presentation. I do not, as you know, I do not do international orders or global governance, so this might be very amateurish. One of the things that struck me was from an IR theory standpoint, there's a concept of soft balancing. Is that applicable to BRICS? Because as an outsider, it looks to me there's an element of performative politics in BRICS rather than cohesive directed purpose, and that reflected in your slide in the timelines between declaration of something to operationalizing something. So that was what I was just curious about. Thank you.
So last chance for question, because we'll be wrapping up afterwards. Okay, Dr. Mukherjee, please.
Thank you, Ivan. So how can India shape this grouping, given that there's already so much dissatisfaction with regard to consensus? I think one of the ways to do that is, as to go back to what Sandeep was saying, if this is US -1, if this is even mostly non-Western powers, you live those values, right? You operate on those values. And so in a sense, if you focus on issues that are of particular concern to the global South countries, right? So for example, I had 2 slides on how to calculate climate emission impacts, which I left out because there was already so much over time. But you can very clearly see literally a North-South divide. And in this, Russia is also implicated, right? That historically, if you count net emissions and who is responsible and then look at the impacts, they're almost inverted, right? That is, global North countries are mostly responsible for climate change, but the impacts are all on global South countries. That is a clear issue where this can be a winning proposition, right? The other is stuff that others have worked at ISAS, like Karthik Nachiappan and others are working on, right? Can India become an exporter of things like India Stack? And it already is in a way, like technology, the low cost. If China was the powerhouse of low cost manufacturing, can India become the powerhouse of low cost services, right? There are ways in which I think India can really build its constituency within the global South countries, focusing on the issues that truly matter to them. The West has never really done that, right? Except from a foreign aid standpoint, which is really more about Western interests than, but of course the danger in all of this is nobody's altruistic in international politics. So you have to do it, and you do it therefore with some sort of pragmatic eye. What would US, can you leave the US out? Is it even possible? I mean, regionally, many organizations have left the US out and have tried to, and have sort of reasonably successfully, I think, managed their affairs. I think the US's role, it's too binary. I think it's too binary to say in or out. I think it's more offshore balancer versus deeply integrated in the region kind of situation, right? And I think that, again, ASEAN offers a good example of this, which is a good way to keep the Americans in without letting them become too preponderant within the organization, and also therefore dealing with China in an inclusive way, right? ASEAN has approached it with that kind of eye. So I think you could imagine a situation where the US is involved in some ways, but on an issue-based basis, rather than being a permanent veto-wielding member of this new thing where then it starts to block the ambitions of others. Is soft balancing what BRICS is doing? It's been a while since I read my TV poll. So yeah, I mean, I think if I recall correctly, soft balancing is mostly about, rather than investing in military or economic measures to deal with a threat or a preponderant power, you start to do diplomatic things, leash slipping and undermining the agenda of organizations and so on. There's a little bit of that, but those countries have been doing that for 30 years after the end of the Cold War, right? BRICS is a more purposive organization, at least on paper. Now, whether it can actually achieve those goals is different. So it's not a negative agenda of balancing against, it's a positive agenda of doing something in the interest of these countries and the global South more broadly. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll allow myself one last question because there are no other questions. So obviously, this presentation and BRICS is haunted by the ghost of China to some extent. How do you think over time, kind of the disparity of power and even status between China and the rest of the major powers in BRICS would impact the organization? Would they soft balance inside the organization? Would they find some kind of concert of BRICS inside the organization, which would kind of manage their differences? I mean, how do you see this dynamic between China and the rest, at least of the leading powers, India, especially Russia also?
I mean, you already see China's impact in who got to join BRICS in the first wave of expansion, right? Those are largely countries that China is quite comfortable with. And this is something that the other countries have had to sort of just get on board with. And it is going to be like that. I mean, so in a way, history rhymes or whatever, right? Like that, the US did this, created an order in which liberal democratic Western powers were privileged. China now creates an order in which non-liberal, non-democratic, non-Western powers are privileged, right? It is a mirror image of sorts. And in that sense, China will build its own order. And the question, of course, is, do you, as India or Brazil or South Africa or even Russia for that matter, I don't think China and Russia are completely aligned on many things. Do you sit by and let that happen, or do you try to shape the choices and the world that China is building? Because they are going to build that world one way or another. The question is, can you benefit from that in some way and be a part of that in a way that does not trample upon your own interests? That is the question that many Latin American countries faced with the United States, or also very many European countries, right? US and Western European alliances are not exactly happy relationships. They have lots of contention and argumentation and politics that goes on between them. So I think it will always just be that negotiation with the most important country in the room. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee, and thank you all of you for coming. It was a pleasure having you at ISAS. Thank you.
Thanks.